We've got Moshe teaching the Torah to the Jewish people. And we've got the Torah telling us that there are two different approaches. One is called Koi Soimar, so shall you say. And one is called Vesaged, and you should tell. Now, on the face of it, doesn't seem to be a big difference between them. But yesterday we discovered that there is a big difference. And that the word Toimar implies that you speak gently, and it implies that you speak generally. In other words, you just give the general principles, what we called Roshei Dvarim. The direct translation of Roshei Dvarim would be headlines. And then, when it comes to Tagaid is to be very detailed and very specific, and potentially even include the details of consequences, of punishment. Then we worked out that the first way of teaching, that's how Moshe is supposed to teach the women. And the second way of teaching is how he's supposed to teach the men. So that implies that there's obviously a very different approach within Judaism in how you teach women and how you teach men. Clearly. Now, nobody brought this up yesterday, so I'll bring it up. That it should surprise you, and I'm not sure that we'll address this today, we may only address this next time, but it should surprise you that in the context of how you teach Torah, it's ladies first. Did you see that? Because it says, Koi Soimar Leveis Yaakov. This is what you should say to the house of Yaakov, which we are now interpreting means the women. And only after that, V'saged Livnei Yisrael, you should tell the men. Most people would not have expected that, for a variety of reasons. The first reason is because the obligation to study Torah is much more of an obligation for men than it is for women, so it should come as a surprise to us that we say first the women and then the men. Okay? It's an interesting thing to think about.
But they take longer to understand.
Okay, so you've got to be very, very careful what you say, right? Okay. So
in a way to like where it says like honor your father and your mother and respect.
Okay, but that's because it gives you both options. Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, it just gives you the one option.
I thought it's for a reason that they say. Yeah.
But I'm saying that gives you both options. It says honor your father and your mother, and then fear your mother and your father. So it gives you both options. Over here, it's just telling you teach the women and then teach the men. Anyhow, think about it. It's interesting, and later on in our conversation, we're going to circle back to it. Now, in the presentation of the two ways that you're supposed to teach women and men, we saw that there are actually two sources. There was a Mechilta, which is one kind of a Midrash, and the Mechilta had two opinions, and then there was the Midrash Rabbah. And what we've done so far is we've aligned the first opinion in the Mechilta with the Midrash Rabbah, and the second opinion in the Mechilta is taking a different approach. And those different approaches are that according to the first opinion in the Mechilta and according to the Midrash Rabbah, this is a piece of the Torah that's telling us you have to know your audience. So you have to understand that women appreciate different things to men, that men process differently to women, and so therefore you can't assume that you could have the same teaching method for both groups. That's the one view. So when you're speaking to women, tell them Roshei Dvarim, just tell them the headlines. And when you're speaking to men, give them all of the detail. Okay? Whereas the second opinion says, this is not so much about who your audience is, this is how you're supposed to teach. That the correct way to teach is, first share the general principle. And once people know the principle, then you can afford to have more discussion. You could say, well, this is the application of the principle, these are the details, etc., etc. Okay, so these are our two views, that it's a matter of who the people are, or it's a matter of how you should teach Torah. In both cases, both opinions, even though their wording and their approach was not identical, but in both cases, they refer to something called Roshei Dvarim, which is headlines. And yesterday, we ended off by saying, until we understand what they mean by Roshei Dvarim, by headlines, we won't really appreciate what each opinion is trying to say.
And also headlines, that's almost an invitation to misinterpret.
Why to misinterpret?
You could imagine anything from a headline.
Okay, that's just...
It might be what the intention is to teach you. You could...
Okay, so fair enough. So let's maybe not get too entangled in the word headlines, because the point is that it's general ideas as opposed to specific ideas. Okay, so again, let's use the example of Shabbos. So the headline, so to speak, of Shabbos is that once a week from sundown on Friday until nightfall on Saturday, you have to rest. That's the general principle. And then the details are what exactly rest looks like, 39 categories of work, the fact that you're supposed to say Kiddush at the beginning and Havdalah at the end. All of that is detail that's going to emerge. So now the question is, how do you use these Roshei Devarim? Because there are two ways that you could use them. So let's explore both possibilities. Once we explore both possibilities, we're going to plug that back into these interpretations. And then the real question is, are the women getting a stronger or weaker version of the Torah? In other words, are they getting the same value of learning as the men are? Or are they getting less value than the men are? Or are they potentially getting greater value than the men are? So until we know what Roshei Devarim are, it's difficult to have that conversation. So let's use the first example. First example is that there's a statement from our sages in the Gemara that says, La'olam yeshane adam letalmidoi derech kitzara. That this is advice for an educator. An educator could be a teacher, could be a parent, could be a rabbi, could be the leader of a team in a business, whatever it is. But here we're talking specifically in the context of Torah learning. La'olam, you should always, yelamed es talmidoi, you should always teach your student derech kitzara, in the shortest way possible. Now what does that mean, in the shortest way possible? So I'll give you an example that the Gemara actually uses in that conversation. The Gemara talks about the fact that you have to be very careful how you speak. And you should avoid saying things that are negative. And you should avoid saying things that are vulgar. So that's the context that the Gemara uses. And then it gives various examples. So one example is that just before the beginning of the great flood of Noach, Hashem tells Noach the various animals that he has to take onto the ark, right? So he tells him that you've got to take from every animal that is tohora, from every animal that is pure, which means that later is going to be considered a kosher animal, and specifically an animal that would be used in sacrifices. So that's like a subcategory within kosher animals. From those pure animals, you have to take 7 of each animal. And then the part that everybody knows much better is the other animals you have to take in pairs. Now, what's the opposite of pure animals?
Trait.
Impure animals, right? So the word for a pure animal is tohira, and the word for an impure animal is tameya, impure. But the Torah doesn't do that. The Torah says you should take the animal that is tohira, and then it says, and the animal asher einena tohira, the animal that does not qualify as tohira, instead of saying the word tameya. Why? Because we don't want to use a more vulgar or negative adjective. So that's one of the things that the Gemara uses to illustrate that you should rather speak in a way that is more euphemistic than a way that could be a negative expression. What's the obvious question?
Why?
No. The obvious question is that the rest of the Torah uses the word tameh multiple times. So if the principle is that you should avoid speaking negatively, why is it that this is the only occasion that the Torah doesn't use the word tameh when describing something that's impure, if this is such a big principle? So the Gemara answers, because it is very important to avoid saying things that are negative, but when you teach, you need to teach in the most direct manner, because otherwise people might not understand what you're saying. So there, it's telling us a story. So when you tell a story, you can afford to play around with the adjectives. But the rest of the Torah is giving us an instruction. And when you give an instruction, instructions have to be clear. So you always have to teach people in the most direct fashion. Now, why do you have to teach people in the most direct fashion? Or, to use a much more literal translation of what the sages say, derech kitzara, you should teach people in a short way. Why is that? Because you have a responsibility, if you're trying to teach somebody, not to confuse them. So if you're going to elaborate too much, too soon, remember this is the teacher to the student. The implication of a student is they're not yet independent in their own learning. They rely on the teacher. The teacher's got to guide them. So that implies they don't yet have a vast knowledge, and they don't necessarily have a mature mind. The student could be a young student. So you have to be sure as the teacher that you're not going to overwhelm or confuse them. So how do you avoid overwhelming and confusing people? Don't be too elaborate. Simplify. Simplify, 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 right? That's how things are going to be. That's how things are going to settle. That's how things are going to resonate. That's how you're going to get your message across. So, for example, children are forever asking parents questions that are deep and philosophical questions. It happened this Shabbos. It's happened to me, I don't know how many times, countless times, as it happens to every rabbi. But this Shabbos it happened. One of the parents in the shul came to tell me that their child has a question, and they very wisely told their child that they should ask the rabbi the question, which essentially means that the parent had no idea what to answer them. So, sure enough, I say, bring over the child, who is 5 or 6 years old, and what's the question? The question is, who made Hashem? It's probably the most common question that children ask. Who made Hashem? Now, the parent is sweating over there, like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say, and how am I supposed to answer this question? So I don't know, how would you answer the question?
Go away.
Asking a rabbi.
Hashem is the creator.
So it's a very, very simple thing. Very simple thing. And I learned this after getting it wrong, I don't know how many times. So eventually I learned how to do it. Say to the child, what do you think? Right? And then the child inevitably says, I think Hashem was always there. And there you go. Issue resolved. You don't have to get into all the philosophy, right? But if you try and explain to a child that there's a concept, as the Rambam calls it, mitziusoi me'atzmusoi, that his existence is intrinsic to his being. I don't think half the adults understand what that means. Now you're going to say it to a child. So the point is, why would you say things in a short, concise manner? Because you need to simplify. So what are Roshei Dvarim in that context? It's the simple principles without getting into the complexities of it. So if I understand that that's what Roshei Dvarim are, then the implication is, the message to Moshe is, when you teach the women, simplify it. They're not into all this complexity. They don't sit and learn Gemara. That's not how women are wired. They just want, just tell them the simple, as very often people believe. Just, tell them the stories, make it feel good. Don't get caught up in all of the nuance and the detail. And just keep it simple, keep it soft, and they'll be happy. So that is that one possibility of what Roshei Dvarim means. Now, if you plug that back in to the first opinion in the Mechilta and the Midrash, it sounds like that's what they're saying. Because if you remember, the Midrash was very specific. The Midrash said what they are able to hear, what they are able to appreciate. So the implication is that women appreciate things that are presented more simply. Don't give me the whole complexity. Just tell me simply, can we afford this? Can't we afford this? You don't have to tell me about the repo rate and about the the current trends in sales and when the new item is going to become available, so the price of this one's going to go down. Don't tell me all that stuff. Just tell me, can we afford it or not? That would be the opinion of the Midrash Rabbah and the first version of the Mechilta. However, there is a completely different possibility of what Roshei Dvarim means. Totally different. And that is, sometimes when you teach something in a concise way, it's because you're brilliant and you're able to encapsulate a lot of information in a simple line. Now that's a real good teacher. Not somebody who so-called dumbs it down, but somebody who's able to convey a thing in a very simple way without losing any of the richness of what they're conveying. Or even more than that, somebody who can capture an entire topic in one concept. So let's use a few examples of this. When a person learns Gemara, which of course is supposed to be the domain of men, right? So you go to the yeshivas, they're learning hours and hours of Gemara. You go to the women's seminaries, Gemara might be a short elective at some point, and maybe there's some radical opportunities out there where women learn a lot of Gemara, but it's not common at all. So when you learn Gemara, how does the Gemara work? First, you learn a Mishnah. Then you learn Gemara commenting on the Mishnah. So the Mishnah might be, let's say on average, about 6 to 8 lines. And the Gemara that comments on that could run into 20 pages. So why is that? What does commentary mean? And very often people misunderstand what commentary means. So the Rambam tells us that the Mishnah is written that beloshen kutsara, in concise language that contains within it many, many concepts. That's the art of Mishnah. Bear in mind that the Mishnah was the first time anybody ever recorded in writing what for generations had been an oral tradition. And the reason, and again the Rambam tells us this, the reason they did it was because life was changing. The Jewish experience was changing. For almost 1,000 years, Jews lived within a very small area, Israel, or perhaps, during the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, they all shifted to one location, essentially in Babylon, and then back to Israel, with an unbroken chain of leadership and teachers. The Rambam goes through all that. He gives us 40 generations of, who was the custodian of Judaism from generation to generation. If you had a question, you could always go to the courts. If they didn't know the answer, they could take you to Jerusalem, to the Sanhedrin. You had a very healthy, closed system. But then, at the time of the Second Temple, the destruction of the Second Temple, when there was the dispersion and Jews were now going to be decentralized and they weren't going to have that kind of access, they needed to have written work that would capture that information. So what did they do? They took dozens of concepts and condensed them into these small Mishnahs. So that's the art of how the Mishnah is written, is that it's able to capture in just a few words massive concepts, and when you pay attention to the words and how exactly it's presented, it helps you to remember all of that information. That's a completely different kind of Roshei Devarim. That's not Roshei Devarim that is simplifying. That is Roshei Devarim that is capturing and then zip filing a whole lot of information. Let's take it one step further than that. When Hashem gave the Torah, which is obviously in this week's parasha, so at Sinai we're told, and King David is the one who essentially summarizes this in a verse in Tehillim, where he says, Achaz diber Elokim, Hashem spoke once, Shtayim zu shamati, and I heard 2 messages. Now really, the Gemara says it's even more than that. Hashem spoke once, and in that one statement, he actually said 10 messages. Meaning that Hashem first said all of the 10 commandments in one shot, but we can't process that. We can only process one series of words at a time. That's why if 2 people are trying to talk to us at the same time, we can't follow the conversation. So certainly if Hashem's going to say 10 commandments in one shot, we can't process it at all. But Hashem did that. And then Hashem began to repeat the commandments one by one. He said the first one, it was too powerful for the Jewish people. He said the second one was too powerful for the Jewish people. And so Moshe had to continue thereafter. That's not what we're focused on. We're focused on the concept that Hashem said all of the 10 commandments in one shot. Now we're told that the whole of the Torah is encapsulated in the 10 commandments. The 10 commandments are encapsulated in the first 2 commandments, so therefore the whole of Judaism is encapsulated in the first 2 commandments, and that's actually quite logical, because the first commandment is, I am Hashem your God, so that captures everything within Judaism that we will do or think or say that illustrates that we believe in Hashem. That includes all the positive mitzvahs. The second commandment, you should have no other gods besides me, that encapsulates the prohibition against anything that will take us away from Hashem or distract us from Hashem, which includes all the negative commandments. So the whole of Judaism is incorporated in the first 2 commandments, and then we're told that the first 2 commandments are encapsulated in the first word, Anoichi. So in one word, Hashem is able to convey the whole of the Torah in a zip file. So now the question is, that is also Roshei Devarim. Now you can use the word headline and it works. This is the headline of the whole of Judaism. So this is not simplifying. This is getting to the root. If you find a seed and then that seed becomes a tree, you appreciate that that seed obviously contained all of the things that make a tree in potential form. So in a sense, the seed is a much more complex or advanced life form than the tree is. So in the same way, that word anoichi is a much more complex version of Torah than the actual Torah that we study, because the Torah that we study is an unpacking and a process that takes a lot of time, whereas here you've captured the essence of everything in one shot. That's a totally different kind of Rosh Devarim, right? That's the second view in the Mechilta. The second view of the Mechilta says that the Torah here is not describing playing to the audience, it's describing how Torah evolves. You know how Torah evolves. First you get the Rosh Devarim. First you get the essence of the Torah, which will be captured in a line or even in a word. Then the next process is the unfolding of that essence into all of its components and all of its details, which will take time and a lot of effort and a lot of investment. According to that view, which is the other opinion in the Mechilta, what did the women get? Rosh Devarim. What's Rosh Devarim? They are given the essence of the Torah. And the men, on the other hand, they're only given the detail of the Torah. So according to that version in the Mechilta, not only is it that Moshe has to speak gently to the women, and by the way, now that reinterprets what the word gently means. Gently means you speak in a way that attracts people to what you're teaching. So over here, what is more attractive to somebody than to tell them, I'm giving you the essence of what this is all about? So in this view, the women's experience of Torah is far superior to the men's experience of Torah. Now you have to ask yourself the question, why? Now you have to ask yourself the question, considering that men are the ones who are obligated to study Torah much more than women are obligated to study Torah, why is it that Hashem would give the essence of the Torah to women and the details to the men?